$50. That was the price of a man's life on a blistering Tuesday in Oakhaven. He was bruised, shackled, and bound for the hanging tree. Athena didn't want a savior, and she certainly didn't want a husband. She just wanted someone who looked as broken as she felt. Sunlight hammered down on the wooden planks of Oakhaven's town square, baking the mud into cracked, pale ceramic. Athena Carter stood near the hitching posts, trying to find shade where there was absolutely none. Her thick woolen skirt, dyed a sensible drab navy, clung stubbornly to her heavy thighs. Beneath the rigid boning of her corset, her ribs ached with a dull, familiar pressure, and she could feel a slick, uncomfortable dampness gathering beneath her arms and at the base of her neck. She was 26, an orphan of the frontier for a little over 6 months, and by the town's unsparing metrics, she was hopelessly, irreparably fat. The tight collar of her cotton blouse felt like a dry rope, but modesty and the desperate desire to avoid the sharp, judging eyes of the mercantile women kept it buttoned tight to her chin. She smelled the square before she really looked at it. Roasting peanuts from a vendor's cart mingled with the sour stench of stale beer drifting out of the saloon doors. And beneath that, the raw, earthy reek of horse manure baking on the thoroughfare. The crowd had gathered like starved dogs around a slaughterhouse drain. Horace Caldwell, the town's assayer and self-appointed magistrate, stood elevated on the back of a flatbed buckboard wagon. Caldwell was a thin, reedy man who smelled aggressively of cheap lilac water and chewed cigars. He gripped a heavy iron chain in his right hand. At the end of that chain was the man they called the Savage. His name was Granger Reed, though few in Oakhaven cared to use it. Athena squinted against the harsh glare to get a better look at him. There was nothing majestic about the man on the block. He wasn't some fallen angel of the plains. He was a wreck. Granger's nose had been broken recently. He breathed through his mouth with a wet, rattling wheeze. His dark hair was matted to his skull with dried blood and pale dust. His shirt, what was left of it, hung in greasy ribbons over a torso that was entirely bruised, a mottled canvas of sickly yellows, deep purples, and angry, swelling blacks. He smelled of fear, dried urine, and the unmistakable, rusty odor of copper blood. He didn't stand tall. He hunched, his shoulders curling inward like a cornered coyote waiting for the final strike of a shovel. $50! Horace's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, thin and nasal. This animal tore up Miller's saloon, stole a gelding from the livery, and put 3 of our men in the infirmary. He owes $50 in damages and fines. If nobody wants to purchase his labor to clear the debt, he hangs at noon. The county won't feed him, and I certainly won't house him. Athena swallowed hard, her mouth tasting of dry ash. She felt the heavy leather coin purse sitting at the bottom of her deep apron pocket. It was her late father's money, $52.40. It was meant for winter seed, a new plowshare, and perhaps enough flour to keep her from starving when the blizzards eventually swallowed the valley. She looked at Granger again. The man slowly lifted his head, his bruised eyelids fluttering against the stinging sunlight. For a fraction of a second, his gaze dragged across the crowd and caught hers. His eyes were flat, dark, and utterly devoid of hope. They looked like wet shale. There was no plea in them, no silent begging for a rescue. He fully expected to die, and from the slump of his shoulders, he was already exhausted by the waiting. Athena didn't plan it. She didn't have a sudden, righteous urge to save a life. She was just so tired of being invisible until someone needed a joke. She was tired of the silence in her farmhouse, so thick it made her ears ring. She took a step forward. Her heavy boots crunched loudly on the dry dirt. "I'll buy him." Her voice broke on the second word. It came out as a pathetic, strained squeak. Athena squeezed, her eyes shut for a second, her face flushing with immediate, agonizing heat. The dampness under her arms turned to a cold trickle. The murmur of the crowd died instantly. It was replaced by a silence so profound, Athena could hear the irritable swish of a horse's tail 20 yards away. Then, the laughter started. It wasn't uproarious, which somehow made it worse. It was a ripple of snickers, harsh whispers, and cruel amusement. The butcher leaned over and muttered something to the blacksmith, who snorted, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Well now," Horace drawled, a greasy smile stretching across his face. He leaned forward over the edge of the wagon. "Did I hear you right, Miss Athena? You want to pay the savage's debt?" "Aye." Athena cleared her throat, forcing her head up. Her cheeks felt like they were on fire. "I said, I'll pay it. I have the money." "And what exactly is a woman of your disposition going to do with a wild dog like this?" Horace mocked, rattling the chain. Granger didn't flinch. He just kept his dead eyes fixed on the wooden planks between his bare, filthy feet. "My fences need mending," Athena lied. Her voice was steadier now, anchored by a sudden, defensive anger. "And my fields need clearing. The law says his labor can be bought for the price of his fines." "Are you refusing my money, Mr. Caldwell?" Horace frowned, his amusement souring. He wanted a hanging, not a transaction. But a crowd was watching, and the law was the law. "Bring it up here, then. But if he guts you in your sleep, Miss Carter, don't expect the sheriff to ride out in the dark to sew you back together." Athena waddled forward. She hated that word, but she knew that's how they saw her moving and approached the wagon. Her hands shook violently as she dug into her apron. She pulled out the leather purse and began counting the coins onto the flatbed. Quarters, $half, worn silver dollars. Every clink was a physical blow to her chest. "I am making a mistake. I am making a terrible, stupid mistake." When she finished, Horace swept the money into his own pocket and tossed the heavy iron key down into the dirt at her feet. "He's your problem now, piggy," a voice hissed from the front of the crowd. Athena bent down. Her corset dug viciously into her diaphragm, making her gasp softly. She grabbed the rusted key. She didn't look at the crowd. She walked over to Granger, who was now staring at her boots. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Granger didn't say a word. He simply turned, the heavy chains dragging through the dust, and followed the fat girl who had just bought his life. The wagon ride back to the Carter farm was a miserable exercise in endurance. Athena sat on the wooden bench, the leather reins cutting into her thick, calloused palms. She drove the team of tired mares with a rigid spine, acutely aware of the shifting weight in the back of the wagon. The wooden wheels ground painfully over rocks and dried ruts, sending jarring vibrations straight up her arms. Behind her, sitting among 50 pounds of grain and a sack of rusted nails, was Granger. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the rhythmic, metallic clink-clatter of his shackles sliding against the wagon bed every time they hit a bump. She couldn't see him without turning completely around, which she refused to do, but she could hear his breathing. It was ragged, catching in his throat like torn fabric. When the farmhouse finally came into view over the ridge, Athena felt a heavy stone of dread drop into her stomach. The place looked worse than she remembered. Since her father's heart had given out in the spring, the property had begun a slow, steady surrender to the dirt. White paint curled and peeled off the porch pillars like sunburned skin. The corral fence leaned tiredly to the left, holding nothing but a single, sickly mule that barely flicked an ear at their arrival. Athena pulled the team to a halt near the porch. She set the brake with her boot and tied off the reins. "Get down," she said, her back still to him. She heard him shift. It took a long time. There was a suppressed grunt of pain, the scrape of iron on wood, and then a heavy thud as his bare feet hit the hard-packed earth of the yard. Athena climbed down, her knees popping loudly in the quiet air. She felt clumsy, massive, and entirely out of her depth. She walked past him without making eye contact and pushed open the front door. The hinges shrieked. The house smelled of old wood, lye soap, and the faint, ghostly trace of her father's pipe tobacco. It was dim inside, the curtains drawn against the afternoon heat. "Inside," she instructed, pointing to the kitchen. Granger shuffled past her. Close up, the smell of him was overwhelming. Unwashed sweat, infection, and dirt. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looking around with quick, jerky movements of his eyes. He wasn't looking at the floral wallpaper or the clean iron stove. He was looking at the back door, the knife block on the counter, the heavy iron skillet hanging from the rack. He was calculating. Athena went to the hearth, picked up a heavy pair of iron bolt cutters her father used for wire fencing, and walked back to him. Granger tensed. His bruised shoulders locked, and his jaw muscles feathered. He thought she was going to hit him. "Hold out your hands," she ordered. Her voice was shaking again. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his wrists. The skin beneath the iron cuffs was rubbed raw, weeping, clear fluid, and blood. Athena positioned the jaws of the cutters over the chain link connecting the cuffs. She had to use her considerable weight, leaning hard over the handles, pressing her heavy chest down to force the blades together. With a sharp snap, the metal yielded. She used the key Caldwell had tossed in the dirt to unlock the cuffs themselves. They fell to the wooden floor with a heavy thud. Granger immediately pulled his hands back, rubbing his raw wrists. He didn't say thank you. He just stared at the iron cuffs on the floor, then looked up at her. "I need water," he rasped. It was the first time she had heard his voice. It sounded like gravel being ground under a heavy boot. Athena walked to the pump at the sink, filled a tin cup, and handed it to him. He grabbed it with a trembling hand and drank it so fast he began to choke. He coughed violently, his broken ribs screaming in protest, and he bent double, spitting a mouthful of water and bile onto the clean floorboards. He froze, waiting for the blow, waiting for the screaming reprimand. Athena just stared at the puddle. "Don't drink so fast. You'll make yourself sick." She grabbed a rag from the counter, dropped to her knees with a heavy thud, and wiped up the mess. When she stood back up, her breathing was labored. "Sit at the table," she said, pointing to a wooden chair. "Take your shirt off." Granger's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because if you die of blood poisoning in my kitchen, I've wasted $50 I couldn't afford to lose," she snapped, a sudden flare of temper, surprising them both. He moved to the chair and sat. Reaching back, he tried to pull the torn remnants of his shirt over his head, but his left arm wouldn't raise past his shoulder. He let out a sharp hiss through his teeth. Athena walked up behind him. "Let me." She gripped the filthy fabric and carefully peeled it away from his skin. It wasn't a romantic unveiling. It was gruesome. The shirt had adhered to several open cuts on his shoulder blades. As she pulled it free, the wounds tore open again, welling with dark, slow blood. His back was a map of violence, old scars layered over fresh, deep bruising. A massive welt across his kidneys looked dangerously swollen. Athena swallowed the bile rising in her own throat. She went to the stove, poured water from the kettle into a tin basin, and fetched a bottle of iodine, a bar of harsh lye soap, and clean rags. She began to wash his back. She wasn't gentle. She couldn't be. The dirt and dried blood were caked deep into his pores. She scrubbed firmly with the soap, the room filling with the sharp, medicinal smell of the lye. Granger gripped the edges of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white, but he didn't make a sound. When she uncorked the iodine, the sharp, chemical tang hit the air. "This is going to burn," she warned, holding the rag over his worst cut. "Do it," he grunted. She pressed the iodine-soaked cloth to the open flesh. Granger's entire body convulsed. A deep, animalistic groan tore out of his throat, and he slammed his forehead down onto the table, his chest heaving. Athena's hands trembled as she continued to dab the antiseptic over his wounds. She felt a profound, ugly contradiction warring inside her. She was terrified of him. He was a violent man, a stranger who could easily overpower her despite his injuries. Yet, beneath the terror, there was a pathetic, shameful spark of validation. Someone was in her house. Someone was relying on her hands. She wasn't just the fat, useless Carter girl in this room. She was keeping him alive. She bandaged him in silence, wrapping torn strips of an old cotton sheet tightly around his ribs. When she finished, she stepped back, wiping sweat from her own forehead. "There's leftover stew on the stove. Eat it. Then you sleep in the barn. There's a cot in the tack room." Granger slowly sat up. His face was pale beneath the grime, but his breathing was marginally easier. He looked at her, really looked at her for a long moment. He didn't see a savior. He saw a frightened, defensive woman, heavy and sweating in the stifling kitchen. "You shouldn't have bought me," he said quietly. "I know," Athena replied, her voice equally low. That night, Athena locked her bedroom door. She dragged a heavy oak chest in front of it, scraping the floorboards. She lay in her bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling with her father's loaded shotgun resting across her stomach. She listened to the wind howling around the eaves, wondering if the man in the barn was sleeping, or if he was just waiting for the dark to come tear her throat out. She had bought a killer because she was tired of eating alone, and now, lying in the suffocating dark, she realized exactly what she had done. Morning arrived without fanfare, dragging pale, indifferent light through the cracks in the window shutters. Athena woke with a violent start, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her neck was horribly stiff. The heavy shotgun still lay across her thighs, the iron barrel cold seeping through her wool skirt. She lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The farmhouse was quiet. No shattered glass, no heavy, creeping footsteps on the floorboards. Only the rhythmic, mournful cooing of a mourning dove out by the water pump. Athena shoved the oak chest away from the door, wincing at the harsh scrape of wood on wood. She stepped out onto the porch, half expecting to find the corral empty and her father's sickly mule stolen. Instead, a sharp, rhythmic thwack echoed across the yard. Down by the sagging fence line, Granger was working. He had found a heavy wooden mallet and a rusted pry bar in the collapsed shed. He was stripped to the waist, the crude cotton bandages Athena had wrapped around his ribs now smeared with fresh dirt and small, blossoming spots of red. With every swing of the mallet, a harsh, involuntary grunt pushed through his teeth. Athena watched him from the porch, her hands nervously wiping down the front of her apron. He was destroying the stitches she'd managed to place on his shoulder. He was probably tearing the muscles in his bruised back, but he was driving new posts into the unforgiving, sun-baked earth. "My fences need mending," she had told Caldwell. Granger had heard her. She went back inside, her stomach twisting with a confusing knot of guilt and lingering dread. She built a fire in the iron stove, the sharp smell of burning pine pitch filling the small kitchen. She fried thick slabs of salted pork and heated yesterday's biscuits in a cast-iron skillet. She poured black, bitter coffee into a tin mug. Carrying the tin plate and mug down to the fence line felt like walking to a gallows. Her thick thighs rubbed painfully together beneath her heavy skirts. The friction, a constant, humiliating reminder of her size. Granger stopped swinging when he heard her boots crunching in the dry grass. He turned, his chest heaving. Sweat cut clean tracks through the gray dust, coating his face. He eyed the food, then looked at her face. He didn't move toward her. He waited, like a stray dog, unsure if the hand held meat or a stone. "You're ruining the bandages," Athena said. Her voice sounded harsh, though she hadn't meant it to be. "Fence was leaning," Granger rasped. He leaned the mallet against a post. He didn't offer an excuse or a plea for gratitude. It was simply a transaction. He ate her food. He fixed her fence. She held out the plate. "Eat this before the grease congeals." He took the plate, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was rough, calloused like cracked leather, and burning with fever heat. He sat down heavily in the dirt, leaning his uninjured shoulder against a fence post, and began to eat. He didn't chew so much as swallow the pork whole, his throat working convulsively. "If you kill yourself out here, I'm out $50, Athena muttered, looking away, staring at the barren ridgeline. Granger paused, a half-eaten biscuit in his hand. He looked up at her, really studying her for the first time in the daylight. He saw the tight, uncomfortable set of her jaw, the way she kept her arms folded securely across her stomach, trying to make herself look smaller. He saw a woman who expected to be insulted at any moment. "I ain't going to die from hitting wood, Miss Carter," he said quietly. It was the first time he had used her name, and I ain't going to run. A man with a bounty and no horse doesn't make it 10 miles in the scrub. Athena swallowed hard, the cynical honesty of his words hitting her like a slap. He wasn't staying out of loyalty. He was staying out of survival. It was a miserable truth, but it was a truth she could trust. "There's more coffee on the stove," she said, turning abruptly and heading back to the house. She didn't look back, but she could feel his flat, dark eyes watching her heavy, awkward retreat. 3 weeks bled into a grueling routine of blistering heat and silent labor. The farm didn't magically transform into a paradise. It remained a stubborn, dusty patch of earth that fought them for every inch. But the fence no longer leaned. The roof of the barn no longer leaked when the brief, violent summer squalls rolled over the valley. Granger healed with the slow, stubborn resilience of a weed. The angry purple bruises faded into mottled yellows and sickly greens. He never complained about the pain, though Athena often heard his breathing catch when he lifted heavy sacks of feed. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of necessity, a nod toward the water pump, a pointed finger at a loose floorboard, a plate of food left silently on the table. Athena found herself changing, too. The constant physical labor stripped away the lingering softness of her grief. Her hands grew tough and calloused. She stopped wearing the suffocating corsets while working, unable to bear the restriction on her lungs in the suffocating July heat. She wore her father's oversized flannel shirts over her skirts, her thick hair tied back in a messy, practical knot. She was still fat. The town would still laugh at her, but she felt a heavy, grounded strength, replacing her constant, vibrating anxiety. The uneasy peace shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Athena was on the porch, a basket of half-peeled potatoes in her lap, when a smart black buggy rattled up the driveway. The sour smell of cheap lilac water reached her before the buggy even rolled to a complete stop. Horace Caldwell climbed out. He was accompanied by a large, thick-necked man Athena recognized as one of the deputies who usually slept off hangovers in the jailhouse cells. Athena set the paring knife down in the basket. Her heart did that familiar, sickening stutter, but she didn't stand up. She pressed her sweaty palms flat against her thighs, forcing herself to breathe evenly. "Afternoon, Miss Carter," Horace drawled, slapping dust from his tailored trousers. He looked around the yard, his eyes lingering on the repaired corral. "See, the place hasn't burned down yet." "Astonishing. What do you want, Mr. Caldwell?" Athena asked, her voice tight. "Just fulfilling my civic duty," Horace sneered, stepping closer to the porch. He looked at her uncorseted figure, his lip curling in undisguised disgust, checking on the county's investment. "We had a break-in at the Mercantile last night. 2 crates of ammunition stolen. Naturally, my mind went straight to the rabid dog you bought off my block. Granger was here all night," Athena said flatly. "He locked the barn at sundown." "Is that so?" Horace chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "And I suppose a woman of your lonely disposition spent the entire night watching him, to be sure?" The deputy snorted loudly. A hot, familiar flush of shame crept up Athena's neck. They were doing it again, stripping her dignity away with a few cruel words, reducing her to a pathetic, desperate joke. She looked down at her heavy, dirt-stained hands. The sharp click-clack of a lever-action rifle chambering a round cut through the thick summer air. Horace froze. The deputy's hand instinctively dropped toward the revolver at his hip, but he didn't draw it. Granger stepped out from the deep shadow of the barn's open double doors. He held Athena's father's Winchester. He didn't aim it at them. He held it casually, the barrel pointed at the dirt, but his posture was coiled, utterly still. He walked slowly across the yard. The oppressive heat seemed to bake into his silence. He stopped halfway between the barn and the buggy. His face was entirely devoid of expression. His eyes, dark and flat as wet shale, locked onto Horace. "The lady told you where I was." Granger's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like an absolute, undeniable fact. Horace swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his stiff collar. The mocking sneer melted off his face, replaced by a sudden, stark realization that he was miles from town, standing in front of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "The debt's paid, Caldwell," Athena said. Her voice cut through the silence. She stood up, the basket of potatoes tumbling onto the porch boards, rolling over the edge and thudding into the dirt. She didn't care. She looked down at the assayer, feeling a sudden violent surge of defiance. He's a hired hand now, my hired hand, and you're trespassing on my property. Horace looked from the large, glaring woman on the porch to the silent, armed killer in the yard. The power dynamic had violently shifted, and he lacked the spine to test it. Fine, Horace spat, backing toward the buggy. But if he steps out of line in town, Miss Carter, the rope won't be negotiable. He scrambled into the buggy, the deputy quickly taking the reins and whipping the horses into a hurried, dusty retreat. Athena stood on the porch, watching the buggy disappear over the ridge until the dust settled back onto the road. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She sank heavily onto the top step, burying her face in her rough, calloused hands. Her chest heaved as she fought back a sudden, overwhelming wave of tears. It wasn't sadness. It was the sheer exhaustion of having to fight for her right to exist. She heard the soft crunch of boots in the dirt. Granger stopped at the bottom of the steps. He carefully leaned the rifle against the porch railing. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she was brave, or that everything was going to be fine. He knew those were lies. Instead, he sat down heavily on the bottom step, his back to her, looking out over the barren, sun-bleached valley. He smelled of sweat, dust, and old leather. "You should have let him take the potatoes," Granger murmured, his voice rough. "Now we gotta wash him again." Athena lowered her hands. She looked at the broad, scarred back of the man sitting at her feet. A short, wet sound escaped her throat, a bizarre hybrid of a sob and a laugh. She wiped her nose on the back of her wrist. "I'll wash them," she said softly. Granger nodded slowly, picking up a stray potato from the dirt and tossing it lightly in his palm. "I'll fetch the water." They sat there as the brutal afternoon sun finally began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, forgiving shadows across the broken earth. They were two outcasts, bound by a $50 debt and the mutual unyielding stubbornness to survive. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a fairy tale. But as Athena listened to the quiet, steady breathing of the man on the step below her, for the first time in her life, the silence didn't feel lonely. Did Athena and Granger's gritty fight for survival keep you hooked? If you loved this raw, unconventional Western drama, smash that like button and hit share so others can discover their story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human tales of outcasts, redemption, and untamed frontiers. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked everything to buy the savage's life? Let me know, and stay tuned for the next wild adventure.